My name is Carrie Brown. I am the Agriculture and Natural Resources Educator for OSU Extension here in Fairfield County. And we are here to talk about spring ephemeral wildflowers in Ohio. We're going to take a look at some of the kind of more common species. I'm not by any means going to cover everything because that would take all night, but I am going to highlight a few. But before we get to that, I'm going to take a minute to look at what is guiding plant development, because up until just a few days ago, we were quite a bit behind where we normally are this time of year, and you may have noticed, and that translates into the spring ephemeral wildflower world as well. All right, so first taking a look at what is a spring ephemeral wildflower. That word ephemeral can be defined as lasting a very short time. So put that together, we're talking about a wildflower that is out for a very short time in the spring. And it's a unique group of plants because they occupy this very narrow blooming window. It's after the soils begin to warm, so spring is coming, but it's before the tree canopy fills. And that's important because at this point in the year, over 50% of sunlight is reaching the forest floor. And this group of plants has figured out a way to take advantage of that, but still deal with some of the cold temperatures that are out this time of year. Because remember, most everything else is still dormant, still sleeping for the winter. This blooming, of course, will decrease considerably towards mid-May because those trees are leafing out. So you're not getting nearly as much sunlight that's reaching the forest floor. And, you know, I'm a plant person. I love all plants, but I think that these spring ephemerals are my favorite, not just because they're beautiful, but because they have figured out a way to fill this niche when, frankly, it's a hard time to be a plant. They have some creative adaptations that allow them to grow when others are dormant. And this window, this narrow window, the timing of it on our calendar can really shift a lot from year to year. And that's what we're going to start with taking a closer look at. So I know I have folks that are joining me from different parts of the state, but today in Lancaster, Ohio, our Ohio Buckeyes are at first bloom. So they're starting to bloom. Our red buds are in full bloom. So they're really putting on a show right now. Our choke cherries are also in full bloom, and our lilacs are approaching full bloom. They're almost there. Now, if we were to go back to April 18th, so 8 days ago, I gave this program at a nature preserve called Coyote Run. And it was Monday, April 18th. And I know that there's a couple of people on here that joined me. It was snowing that day. So nothing says spring wildflowers like snow. But I wanted to show this as an example because just 8 days ago, it was quite different than it is today. The Ohio Buckeye and the lilacs were not blooming yet. The red buds were close, but not quite. And then the choke cherries were just starting to bloom. So our plant development looked quite different just 8 days ago. So it's pretty amazing what a week can do. If we go back a little bit farther in time, so this is April 18th, 2021. Our Ohio Buckeyes were in first bloom. The red buds were in full bloom. The choke cherries were in full bloom, and the lilacs were approaching full bloom. Now, this should look familiar because this is where we are at today. So we're April 27th, 2022. That was April 18th, 2021. Obviously different places on the calendar, but the same spot in plant development. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that our human-derived calendar isn't driving plant development. Our plants are not watching the calendar. It simply isn't that simple. So if I were to say, red buds begin blooming on April 8th every year, you could say, Carrie, that's a false statement because that was the case in 2021. But this year, the red bud in my backyard didn't start blooming until April 16th. And that's simply because our plants aren't watching a calendar. They don't use our system of organizing days. Instead, their development and the development of many insects is based on heat. It's based on the accumulation of heat over a given time. Now, we have given this a term, a value, and we call this growing degree days. This is, I think, often a difficult concept to understand and to teach. And I think it's what really makes it confusing is that word days, because we typically think of a day as a 24-hour period. With growing degree days, this is an accumulation of heat. So a unit of heat that can be used to estimate growth and development of many plants and insects. So a 24-hour period could have 25 growing degree days in it. If you have a really warm day and you have a lot of heat accumulating, it can also have 0, like that snowy Monday. On that snowy Monday, we accumulated no growing degree days because there was no heat accumulated. Now, if you want to get into the math of this, which we're not going to get very far into the math of this, but I welcome you to, this number of this growing degree days is calculated using the accumulation of average daily temperatures. What I want you to know is that each plant species requires a specific amount of accumulated heat to obtain a certain life cycle stage. So in order for a red bud to reach first bloom, it needs a certain amount of growing degree days. And that's not always going to line up on the same day each year. And that's because that accumulation of heat is going to change from year to year. Now, every day we start, or every January, we start at 0. So every January we start at 0 growing degree days. And then that number increases as heat accumulates throughout the calendar year. There are no negatives. So if we have a really cold day, we don't lose growing degree days, but we can have instances where we don't accumulate any growing degree days, such as that snowy Monday. This is closely related to a term that you might be familiar with, and that is phenology. So phenology is nature's calendar. It tells us that things happen in generally the same order every year, but not necessarily the same time on our human-derived calendars. Now, I say generally because we all know that nature is not simple. Nature has so many different variables. So there are other factors that can contribute to timing, such as damage from a late freeze. The fertility of soil can have an effect on when things achieve certain life cycle stages. Whether something's in direct sunlight or shade, changing climate conditions, the presence of weeds. So generally, the schedule of emergence is predictable. So things are going to happen in that same order every year. Now, some of you may be familiar with this site. This is the Ohio State Phenology calendar. I can spend hours on this thing. It's pretty fun. It's a tool that calculates the growing degree days for the zip code and the date that you entered. So you can go back in time and you can see where we were 5 years ago on this day. And then you can fast forward and see where we are this year. When you put in a date and a zip code, so here I put in the zip code for Lancaster 43130, and this is April 18th, 2021. So we're going back a year and a week. You will see that we were at growing degree days 258. So at this point, the flowering dogwoods were almost blooming. Flowering dogwoods bloom at 263 growing degree days. That's how much heat they need in order to achieve that bloom. Whereas the Japanese flowering crab was in full bloom because it had just achieved that heat accumulation, that growing degree day. Now, if we fast forward to a week ago, this is that snowy Monday that I gave a wildflower walk. We were only at 204 growing degree days. So it was cold. It had been cold up until then. So we had a kind of a slow start to the spring. The flowering dogwoods were far from first bloom, and the Japanese flowering crabs were not even at first bloom yet, whereas the year prior, they were already in full bloom. Now, why did this happen? It's because there was less heat. Less accumulated heat means less development. So as of April 18th, 8 days ago, we were quite far behind April 18th of 2021. Now, that was 8 days ago, and a lot has happened since April 18th. And if we fast forward to, I didn't use today's because today's growing degree days, it's posted at the end of the day. So I went with yesterday. So as of yesterday, we were at 282 growing degree days. So that means we went from 204 to 282 in an 8-day period. So we accumulated 78 growing degree days in just 8 days. How does this compare to last year at this time? Well, as you can see, not only have we caught up to April 26, 2021, but we've surpassed it by 1 day. So with those 8 days, we caught up. We accumulated 78 growing degree days. In 2021, that same 8-day period, we only accumulated 23 growing degree days. So what does that tell us? It tells us what we already know, that we had a really hot weekend. That hot weekend that we had when we had those mid 80s, it was practically beach weather. That's when we got that big bump. And that's where a lot of those 78 growing degree days came from. So and I took all of this from that OSU Phenology calendar website. If we look at where we achieved those bumps in temperature, if we look at Monday, remember we were at 204. This was the snowy Monday. Tuesday, still at 204. It must have stayed cold. We didn't achieve growing degree days. That tells us that their heat was not accumulating. Things were not really growing. We must have had a bump in temperature from Wednesday to Thursday because we did achieve a little bit of growing degree days. If you remember, Friday was a really nice day. It was like low 70s. So we accumulated 10 growing degree days. But then bam, here comes the weekend. So this was the kicker. We had a really hot weekend. On Saturday, we achieved 18. Sunday, 20 growing degree days. Monday, 17 growing degree days. So if you're paying attention, you should have noticed a pretty big change in plant development over this past weekend, because we caught up and surpassed where we were last year, just because we had those really hot temperatures. Of course, Tuesday of this week, we only achieved 2 growing degree days. It was kind of a cool day, very similar to today. So I would expect that today, we might have achieved a couple more as well, but nothing like these numbers that we saw over the weekend. And that's simply because it was hot. It was in the mid 80s. I know Sunday night, it only got down to like mid 60s. So that average temperature was staying pretty warm, especially for this time of year. But hey, that's Ohio. So you might wonder, how does that compare to other years? So this year, this is for yesterday in Lancaster, Ohio. We were at 282 growing degree days. We already saw that in 2021, we were at 281. But you can kind of see throughout the years, 2018, we were only at 184. So 2018 was a chilly year, a chilly start to the year. Whereas in 2017, it was a warm spring. So we had kind of a head start in 2017. We were quite a bit farther along this time of year than we are this year. So there's a lot of variation in it. But you can kind of see where we are right now is probably about average. Now, if you're interested in taking a look at this calendar, you can just Google Ohio State Phenology calendar. Like I said earlier, I'll also drop this in the link. But this calendar was created as a tool for farmers and gardeners to know when to start scouting for pests. I want to give you an example. you're able to look at the full calendar on the website as well. And you will see that the Eastern Redbud starts blooming at growing degree day 191. No matter what year it is, it's always going to start blooming once it gets to that accumulation of heat. It may begin beginning of April, it may be the end of April, but it needs to hit that accumulation of heat. Meanwhile, the spongy moth, also known as the gypsy moth, it achieves egg hatch at growing degree day 192. So you are able to use this red bud as an indicator to know when the spongy moth is starting to hatch, so that you know when to start scouting for those caterpillars. These two events, they simply require a similar amount of accumulated heat. They're not necessarily connected to one another, but we can use them as indicators of one another to when to start to scout for some of these pests. And as you look down through here, the things that you see in bold, those are the pests, and some of them are weeds and some of them are insect pests. And you can see where these different phenology these different life cycle stages line up with other things that are happening around them. So it can be a very handy tool. So we're going to move into our spring ephemeral exploration. When I first did this, first gave this presentation, a lot of these were not out yet, but I was out hiking yesterday and I'm amazed by what that weekend heat. So a lot of these wildflowers have emerged, and you can go and you can see them in nature. A couple of them are probably getting really close, but not quite there, but most of them have emerged, and some of them are actually done with their blooming period at this point. An example of that is skunk cabbage. So skunk cabbage is done blooming. It is our earliest bloomer, and on each of these slides, you're going to see a date. And this date is an indicator of bloom period. So not necessarily when the plant is out. For instance, skunk cabbage is no longer flowering. At this point, it's done flowering, but it's still out. So that's what that indicates. And then on each of these, it has the common name as well as the scientific name. So skunk cabbage, we don't typically think of this as a wildflower, but it is a flower. It's got a flower in there. It's one of our earliest and smelliest native plants. It begins appearing in late winter. I've seen it as early as January. I think it looks remarkably alien-like. And it is a very unique plant in the sense that it is able to emerge when there is snow on the ground. And it does that by producing its own heat. So it's actually able to melt the surrounding snow with that heat. And then that heat also helps to spread its pungent odor into the air, and it attracts early pollinators, and that's mainly scavenging flies. So it doesn't have a smell that us humans appreciate, but it is appreciated by its pollinators. And that's what really matters to this plant. Eventually, it turns into these really beautiful green, shiny leaves that will continue to grow. That can grow up to 2 feet high. And it's often found in wetland areas. So really swampy areas, marshes, and other low-lying areas. It's just a really cool plant that has some really neat adaptations. Cut-leafed toothwort is up next. You're going to see this blooming before most anything else in early March. You may be able to see from the photo that it has 4 petals, and that's because it's in the mustard family. Just about everything in the mustard family, if not everything, has 4 petals. And sometimes this is going to be a white in color. It can also be pinkish or purple, but it's a very common plant. You'll find it in rich woodlands, but you'll also find it in woodlands that are disturbed or regenerating. It's a really important nectar source for some of our earliest native pollinators. But unfortunately, cut-leafed toothwort, as well as many of other spring wildflowers, have been displaced by kind of an evil family member, and that is garlic mustard. So garlic mustard, hence the name mustard, is also in the mustard family. but it is an invasive species. It is not native to here like the cutleaf toothwort. So it's a threat to not only this wildflower, but a lot of other things that are growing in the understory this time of year. Bloodroot is up next. This is in the poppy family. It's named for the reddish orange sap that's found in the root and the stem. This plant has a lot of medicinal properties. It's fairly common, but I still feel like it's a treat to see it. You don't typically find it in large populations. And this flower is always on a single stem. So a single flower enclosed by a single leaf that will eventually unfurl. And as you can see, it has this really interesting lobed pattern to it. So this time of year, if you're out in the woods, you may see the stem, but at the end of it is going to be the seed pod. And at this point, the leaf is unfurled. So it's hard to see here, but there's a little seed pod here. That's from that flower that's been successfully pollinated. So these leaves will hang out for a while, but they are ephemeral. Eventually, they will go dormant. Rue anemone. So this is in the buttercup family. It's small, it's delicate, it's easy to miss. It's in kind of small clumps, but not typically very large populations, just kind of a clump here and a clump there. It's fairly common in a variety of woodland habitats, from floodplains to even drier uplands. And if you're lucky, you might find a stand with pinkish flowers. I've seen that happen. I've seen that once. But most of the time it's this brilliant white, and sometimes those leaves can be a little bit of a kind of a maroonish color. It's a very attractive plant, but I find it easy to miss just because it is small and low and low to the forest floor. Interestingly, this plant, it offers no nectar reward to visiting pollinators, but the species is still frequented by small bees and flies that'll actually dine on its pollen. So mid-March to mid-April, you'll start seeing purple cress. On our wildflower walk at Coyote Run, we saw quite a bit of this. It is also in the mustard family. So you see those 4 petals there. So it is in the same genus as the cutleaf toothwort. As you can see, the flowers look very similar. The leaves look very dissimilar. We don't have those deep lobes here. It's fairly common. It's found in every county in Ohio. It has white to light purple petals. It can grow to about 1 foot in height. And like its cousin, cutleaf toothwort, it's able to withstand some of those disturbed sites, but it really likes that rich woodland as well. White trout lily. So this is a cool plant. It is a member of the lily family, as the name says, and its immature form, it's going to be a single leaf that has this kind of green and brown mottling to it. These can form humongous colonies. I've seen these form colonies that are over 1 acre in size. But most of the time, you're only going to see these single leaves sticking out, because it can take these plants up to 8 years to mature and flower. Now, when they flower, they're going to send up 2 leaves with this single flower in between. These leaves are going to be of unequal size. And as you can see, the flower kind of has this bell shape to it. This is white trout lily, but there's another species in this same genus that is yellow trout lily. And it's found in a lot of the same areas that you're going to find white trout lily. Very cool plant. Spring beauty. If you are familiar with any of these plants, this is the one you're familiar with. It is common, it's frequent, it can be found in full sun, in woodlands, pastures, even untreated lawns. It typically is white with these tinges of various shades of pink. Some of them are really light, some of them are almost a purple color. And interestingly, these stripes, these purple stripes that you see there, they serve the same purpose as the lines on an airport runway. So they are acting as guides for visiting pollinators leading them straight to the nectar reward. And of course, the plant benefits from that because it gets pollinated. This plant is a very important nectar source for small native bees. And the bee that you see here, this is a native mining bee. And it is a spring beauty specialist. So it is only going to visit spring beauties when they're blooming from late March to early May. They co-evolve together. Next up is twin leaf. I've only seen twin leaf less than 6 times probably. This is not a very common plant. So because of that, I think it's kind of a real treat to see. This photo I know I took in the morning because these guys, they bloom for a single day and then they're done. The leaf itself, this entire thing is a leaf. These are 2 leaflets. So it's going to have 2 leaflets on a single leaf on a long stem with this flower with a longer stem right next to it. It's not a true ephemeral because those leaves will stick around into the summer, but the blooming period is in the spring from late March to mid-April. Dutchman's breeches. So I always say that this wins the award for the most fun name. They're pretty adorable. You can see why they got their name, Dutchman's breeches. They look like a little pair of pants. They're in the same genus as bleeding heart. So if you're familiar with that garden plant, the foliage looks very similar, and I'm sure you can see resemblance with the flowers as well. It likes moist to well-drained soils, and its chief pollinator is bumblebees. The seeds are dispersed by ants, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a little bit. But it's just a real delicate, beautiful plant. A lot of times you'll see the foliage and it doesn't always flower every year, but pretty neat plant. Closely related is squirrel corn. So this wins the award for the weirdest name. You can see the resemblance. It doesn't have those long spurs or pant legs, I guess, that the Dutchman's breeches has. It looks more like a kernel of corn, and those spurs are more rounded on the end here. The foliage looks almost identical, and a lot of times you'll see them growing in the same area. You can see then the background here. There is Dutchman's breeches growing right behind the squirrel corn. And I think I took these photos at Bach Hollow. Bach Hollow has a really nice display right along the road, actually, of Dutchman's breeches and squirrel corn. It doesn't tend to be quite as common as Dutchman's breeches, but very similar. Jack in the pulpit. So this is fairly common in a variety of wooded habitats. Typically find these as single plants rather than huge populations. And the jack in this case is the spike that you see right in the center of the plant. And this spike is covered with tiny flowers, and they produce a what we perceive as a bad odor, and in order to attract its pollinators, which is tiny flies. And you can see that the pulpit, which is the surrounding part, comes in a variety of different colors. This is a particularly dark one, but I've seen jack in the pulpits that are in different shades, kind of in between this green and in between this kind of maroonish / dark brown. And in the fall, you might see the fruit. So this is the fruit, and you can see that's the spike. So that's the spike. So this is, of course, the pulpit at this point has died back so that the fruit is revealed, and it ripens to this beautiful red color in order to attract its dispersers. So each of those little fruits were a tiny flower that was pollinated by a tiny fly that used to be on this spike. Pretty cool. We all know common blue violet. This is the most common of all violet species. It's often found in mowed yards and unnatural habitats, but it can be found in the woods as well. I know that it really likes my garden. It's all over my garden. They do hybridize, so you may find violets of kind of varying color, but this time of year you're liable to find whites and yellows and maybe even more of a lavender color, but pretty little plant, and its seeds are distributed by ants also. This is what I have in the background of my photo. This is Virginia bluebells, and this is a fan favorite. I think that out of all of these, this is one of them that you're most likely to find for sale at a garden center. And it can form these large colonies. The picture that I have behind me in my picture is of Stroud's Run down in Athens. It has some really fantastic displays. So if you have a chance the next week or two, it's worth a visit. It can form these large colonies. It's often on floodplains, and it is a true ephemeral because shortly after it blooms, this plant does wither away and it goes dormant for the rest of the year. It's pollinated by long-tongued bees, so they need to be able to get to the nectar reward, which is way down at the base. That's also where the pollen is. As well as moths and butterflies and even hummingbirds might visit these flowers. Blue cohosh is up next. These have cute small flowers that mature into kind of these gorgeous blue berries that are coveted by wildlife. The flowers themselves are typically yellow. This is the only picture I've ever taken of blue cohosh. And as you can see, it kind of has these maroon tips. So my guess is it has there's another species called giant cohosh that is in this same genus, and its flowers are a dark maroon color. So I suspect that this could be a hybrid. I haven't confirmed that. Anyways, it's kind of a cute little flower that blends in with the background. But when it fruits, those definitely stand out. The great white trillium. This is our state wildflower. So you definitely have seen this printed on things. Hopefully you've seen one in real life. They are blooming right now. Great white trillium is in the lily family, and there's actually 44 species of trillium that are native to Ohio. It's fairly common in woodlands, especially this species of trillium, especially in a woodland that has a kind of a nice diverse wildflower display. And as those flowers age, they're going to start to turn pink. So when you're out hiking, you might see flowers that kind of have a pinkish hue to them. And they may be an aging great white trillium, or they could be another species of trillium, because there are species of trillium that are pink. So it could be one or the other. It can occur in large stands. And if you're local here in Lancaster and you kind of want a quick little hike, I encourage you to visit Schallenberger State Nature Preserve off of 22. You don't have to hike very far in order to see a gorgeous hillside full of great white trillium that are in bloom right now. Unfortunately, this plant is also coveted by deer. So you have to beat deer to it because they can clear an entire patch pretty quickly. It must taste pretty good to them. Wild blue phlox is blooming right now also. I was walking at the woodland that's right behind OU Lancaster yesterday, and I saw quite a bit of this in bloom. It's fairly common. It'll even grow in sites that aren't that great. So kind of regenerating sites. And this is something that you might find at a garden center as well. Sometimes it's called wild sweet william. It occurs in different shades of purple. Butterflies love it, especially swallowtail butterflies. And it's often confused with a invasive species called Dame's rocket. So if it's midsummer and you see a plant that looks like this along the roadway, it's not wild blue phlox. So this has a blooming period of early April to late May. And this lookalike, Dame's rocket, is in the mustard family. If you were to look at it closely, it only has 4 petals, whereas phlox has 5 petals. And it comes in a variety of colors. reds, bright pinks, light pinks, purples, lilacs. It's actually a very attractive plant, but it's highly invasive. So if you see those along the roadways in the summer, people often confuse them with phlox. They are not. It's not something that you want to collect seed off and propagate. This is one of the native good guys, though. Toadshade. So another funny name, but a really cool little flower. You probably see the resemblance with the trillium that we saw before. It has those 3 leaves, except these are mottled, and it doesn't have that stem. So the flower itself is stalkless. It's attached directly to those 3 flowers. And at Coyote Run on that day, this was very abundant and it was flowering. So that tells me that this flowers a little bit before the great white trillium, because that was not flowering yet that day. But at this point, they're both flowering. Fire pinks. So this is just a neat little flower with these fringed petals. It's scattered statewide, but it's usually in small clumps. I never find large patches of these. It's usually just like one in the distance, because you can see this from a distance. It definitely stands out. It's this beautiful red color. And as you may have guessed from the color, it is loved by hummingbirds. So hummingbirds are an important pollinator. So if we look at this blooming period from early April to June, this is a later one, because if it relies on those hummingbirds as pollinators, well, the hummingbirds are just coming back. So kind of a neat connection there. Bellwort is up next. This always kind of reminds me of kind of like a droopy basset hound. This is just what they look like. They're in the lily family. They're naturally really droopy. They're pollinated by small bees, and the seeds are dispersed by ants. And right now I am seeing a ton of these at Alley Park. So if you're in Lancaster, that's a good place to go in order to see some bellwort displays. Wild ginger is up next. This is it's low growing. It's not a true ephemeral, because these leaves are going to stick around into the fall, but the bloom is from mid-April to late May. The bloom itself is kind of a maroon, some might even say brown in color, and it's at the very base of the plant. Sometimes it's covered by leaves. So you really have to dig around for it in order to see it. I have read studies that say that it's pollinated by small flies, but I've also heard that it self-pollinates. But regardless, kind of a neat little flower there at ground level. The leaves themselves, I think, are the real beauty in this plant, because of this fine hair. It gives them this like shiny, glistening texture. It really stands out from other leaves surrounding it. Schallenberger has a really nice display of wild ginger. It is not related to the ginger that you buy at the store, but the root has a similar smell to it. So if you were to scratch the root of the plant, you would that it would resemble the smell of the ginger that you might cook with. Violet wood sorrel. You're probably familiar with sorrel that has yellow flowers. The foliage is going to look really similar to this, but with yellow flowers. I know that growing up, we always called it sour grass because of the sour taste of the foliage. In fact, it's not a grass. And this particular sorrel is only going to flower in spring, so mid-April to early May. And it may be small, but it's quite showy. It can form small colonies. And it's I think it's a real looker with the pretty purple, and oftentimes there's multiple flowers on a stem. And last but not least, there's mayapple. So this is a pretty commonly recognized plant. It will persist in a site that's been logged that was once wooded. So if you see a patch of these, that's an indication that there used to be woods there. It spreads mostly vegetatively through rhizomes, so you don't always see its flower. Most of the time, you're going to see just these single stems with this umbrella leaf. But if you see one with two stems, sometimes the stem diverges about halfway up, at that crotch is where you're going to see the flower. To my knowledge, these are not yet flowering. I was at Alley Park this weekend and I was looking at them and they were still pretty tightly, the buds were tightly closed, but it probably won't be long. So late April to mid-May, and those will form a May apple. So that's its fruit, its seed pod. And interestingly, its main disperser of seeds is eastern box turtle. So eastern box turtle loves to munch on some May apple and move those seeds around. Now these plants are really interesting because they have such strong connections to their pollinators. They mostly rely on insects for pollination. So a lot of our spring trees, they're relying on wind. But since these guys are so low to the ground and oftentimes they're in woodlands, the wind isn't going to do a whole lot of good for spreading pollen. So they have co-evolved with native bees, wasps, flies, and beetles. And a lot of these are really early emerging insects. And I know you saw this photo earlier, but this is an example of this. This is called the spring beauty miner bee. And it's called the spring beauty miner bee because it is a specialist for miner bee. They co-evolve together. Pretty neat. As far as seed dispersal, so let's say they've been pollinated and they fruit. Now, those seeds need to get away from the parent plant so that they can have their own space and they can develop. There's a few different ways that they can do that. A lot of times plants will use wind and water. If you think about a dandelion, it's utilizing wind because each of those seeds comes equipped with its own little parachute. And a lot of seeds will float in order to utilize water. Kind of the more interesting stories are those that rely on animals. So colorful berries. So when berries ripen in the spring, that changing of color is an indicator to animals that, hey, my seed is developed, come eat me and poop me out somewhere else. And that's exactly what they do. That's how those seeds are distributed. The same with fleshy fruit, nutrient-rich nuts, and then burrs on fur. So some of those things that we find to be a pain because we're picking off our pants, especially in the fall, those are designed to do that, to stick to pants or to stick to the fur of animals in order to be transported to someplace else. But my favorite type of dispersal is indulging ants. So now we're going to talk about how ants are able to help these plants disperse their seeds. Now, this is the case for a lot of these different species that you saw today. So bloodroot, trillium, Dutchman's breeches, trout lily, violet, wild ginger. Each of these, when they develop their seed, on the seed is this little kind of fatty appendage. And this appendage is full of nutrients. And it turns out that to ants, this is like a piece of steak. They love it. They can't get enough of it. And not only does it taste good, but it's actually very nutritious for them. So they will visit these plants, these different species that you see here, after those seeds develop, and they will transport those seeds into their colonies. Now, after they eat off the elizome, which is that fleshy appendage that you see there, then they have no more interest in the seed. They're not going to eat the seed. They're going to leave the seed where it is. Thus, they're planting the seed. So pretty cool how these species have co-evolved together. The plants are kind of tricking them into planting their seed, but it requires them to create this fleshy appendage, which takes energy from the plant in order to do this. So, it works out for both of them. Now, as we wrap up here, spring ephemerals, though they are resilient, they are also susceptible to changes because of their narrow blooming window. They occupy that very narrow window when a lot of other things are dormant. And because of that, they can be susceptible to environmental changes and disturbances. basically it's a really hard time to be a plant. So there's a lot of challenges that they face. Some of those challenges include habitat destruction, and a lot of time that's going to come in the form of development. It might be an overpopulation of browsing animals, such as deer. Invasive plants is one of their largest threats. So these are plants that are going to compete with resources, and in some cases, shade out some of the plants that are relying on that sunlight. For instance, bush honeysuckle starts leafing out before our native species. So it's able to, in some cases, shade out some of these spring ephemerals that need that sunlight. And of course, the uncertainty of a changing climate too. So we're not exactly sure how these warmer winters, these rainier springs are going to affect this group of plants. Now, what can you do? I think the number one thing that you can do is, if you steward a piece of land, and even if you don't steward a piece of land, find some place to volunteer. I think the biggest thing that we can do is to help protect our native plants by taking out some of those invasive plants. On their home turf, such as garlic mustard, for instance, because that's I think a widely known one. On their home turf, so where they came from, there's plant and animal populations that are able to keep their populations in check. So they have these natural controls. But they get over here, and that's not the case. So that's how a plant will become invasive, is there's nothing to keep it in check. So it falls on us. So we are able to help keep it in check by removing some of these introduced plants. Some of the most common culprits in woodland areas include bush honeysuckle, privet, garlic mustard, multiflora rose, Japanese honeysuckle, and autumn olive. Of course, there's a lot more invasive plants than just these 6, but these are the 6 that are going to be most likely to compete with these spring ephemerals because they are able to reside in woodlands. I'm going to drop a link in the chat for invasive plant fact sheets from the Ohio Invasive Plant Council that can provide information on how to manage some of these species. And then, of course, you're always welcome to contact me as well with specific questions about invasive plant ID or invasive plant management.